Yes.
In the light of what you just mentioned, what is the role of renunciation?
What is the role of renunciation?
That's the first part.
Yeah.
And the second, what was the inner state or the inner realization of the Buddha according to what you found out?
Okay. Well,
thank you.
Renunciation is a key term in Buddhism, obviously. And the question we have to ask is, what is being renounced? Now, my own sense is that what we seek to renounce is not, the home, the life of the lay person in society, for example, which is the way modern monasticism often presents the idea that the monk is the person who leaves home and lives a simple life. But rather, what is to be renounced is a particular relationship we have with ourselves in the world. And the Buddha would have identified this as a relationship based on attachment, or aversion, and confusion. What needs to be renounced, therefore, is a way of being in the world rather than the world itself. Now, I think historically, even at the Buddha's time, the Buddhist community was, in a sense, unavoidably identified with the Indian ascetic tradition. The samanas, I mentioned, the wandering monks, the ascetics. The Buddhist movement was part of that general movement. And I think as Buddhism became institutionalized, you get a stronger and stronger sense of difference between the professional monastics, who more and more start to live in residential communities, which is something the Buddha did not envision, as opposed to the world out there. And so you get this periodically you get this increased separation between the Buddha's teaching, which is going on in the monastery, and the worldly life, which is the next best, let's say. People, if they're lay people, can aspire to be reborn as a monk or a nun, preferably a monk. And that, I think, is a bit of it's a bit of a caricature of what, in fact, renunciation is about. And in fact, you can easily adopt the lifestyle of a monk and still be driven by your attachments and your aversions and your confusions and your fears. The real renunciation is letting go of craving, of grasping. And that's quite clear in the Buddhist text. Next question. The Buddha's own inner state of awakening. Well, I would cite two primary sources for this. First is the Arya Pariyesana Sutta, the Discourse on the Noble Quest, which is the 26th middle-length discourse, where the Buddha describes his awakening in a very succinct way. It's one of the few texts where you actually have the Buddha telling his own story. It's here where we find his own account of leaving home, his own account of studying with these two teachers, and his own account of his awakening. And there it's quite clear. He describes his awakening as not a kind of knowledge or understanding. He doesn't use a word that implies knowing anything. He describes his awakening as a radical shift of perspective. A shift of perspective from being identified and caught up with his identity, his position in the world, his self, his idea of who he is as a psychological individual, and a recognition of what he calls the ground, the tanna. And this ground he calls ida pachayata paticca samuppada, that this conditionality, conditioned arising, dependent origination, is how it's usually translated. So his awakening is a shift from a position in which you define yourself in terms of some political, social, economic, philosophical, religious identity as something that is in a way what you hold on to define yourself. and another way of being in the world, again, which is defined by your coming to terms with the fluid, contingent, unpredictable, unreliable, mysterious nature of what is rising and passing in each moment. And that leads, in the second part of the same text, to the falling away of craving, the falling away of attachment, and the experience of what he calls nibbana. Now, nibbana, nirvana, refers quite simply to the ending of greed, the ending of hatred, and the ending of delusion. It's not some place, it's not some heaven, but it's a possibility that is there in each moment of life, to live from that other perspective. So the awakening is a shift of perspective in which a certain attachment or relation to our being in the world has fallen away. The other text in which the Buddha defines his awakening in absolutely clear terms is the first sermon called The Turning of the Wheel of Dhamma, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, in which, at the conclusion of which, the Buddha says, it was not until my knowledge and vision of the 12 aspects of the Four Noble Truths was clear to me that I could claim to have achieved a peerless awakening in this world. That to me is a fundamental text. In other words, the Buddha's awakening, as then is described in this text, is once again not a mystical type experience of some transcendent unity, whether you think of this in terms of God or in terms of some sort of ultimate reality or absolute. There's no mention of anything like that. But rather it is a complex relationship to the suffering of life, dukkha, to the letting go of grasping or craving, by the experience of actually stopping that way of being. And in that stopping, in that openness, having the possibility of creating and cultivating a way of life in the world, the Eightfold Path. In other words, the Buddha's awakening is not reducible to some sort of private, personal experience of a sort of mystical nature in which you touch into some higher or absolute truth, but rather it is a radical reorientation of how you live in and respond to the situations of life.
In such a case, the technique,
the what?
The technique that he taught must have been different than what we know today, according to traditional, let's say, Tibetan style of teaching, isn't it?
No, not entirely. You see, I balk a bit at the word technique. Technique implies a sort of a series of steps, a series of exercises that will produce a specific result and solve a problem. The Buddha presented a whole range of approaches: ethical, contemplative, philosophical, psychological, in which he sought to reorient the whole of the human person, not just the spiritual bit, to life in the world. And in the Tibetan tradition, in which I trained, there is again a whole range of practices. And to me, the most valuable ones were the contemplative, the reflective practices, in which you think more carefully and clearly about your situation in life. The Lojong practices that you find in Tibetan Buddhism, I think, are very, very similar to the sort of style of teaching he would have had. But it's true that when we get into, say, Vajrayana and Tantra and these things, certainly the Buddha didn't teach those. The other important thing to bear in mind is that the Buddha never divides the world into relative truths and absolute truths. This is a later thing that comes about in all Buddhist traditions, which I think is a slippage back into the default Indian view of the world, where there's an absolute reality called God, and then this illusory world called Maya. The Buddha never makes that sort of dualistic split, which I think is very important. I think you find throughout all the Buddhist traditions today elements of practice and of ethics and so on, which have strong resonances with what you find in the early tradition. But I do feel also that many of the Buddhist schools have perhaps lost sight of some of these elements and have substituted them more with practices that aim at gaining direct insight into some ultimate truth or reality, which I think is against what the Buddha taught. Yes?
Did he say anything about reincarnation?
Well, yes, he did. I mean, the Buddha spoke quite, if you read the Pali Canon, many of the Buddha's teachings are framed in the perspective of past and future lifetimes. His whole understanding of liberation, in the deepest spiritual sense, is presented in terms of the number of lives you have to go before you'll be able to stop existing in samsara. There's many instances of that. But you have a problem. You find other passages in which the Buddha seems to poo-poo the whole idea. There's the Kalama Sutta, for example. The Buddha says whether there is a life after death or not, whether actions do bear fruits after death, doesn't really matter. What matters is your own putting into practices of these ideas here and now, to paraphrase slightly. You also have these famous 10 points the Buddha refused to make any comment about. Does the world have a beginning? Does it have an end? Is it finite? Is it infinite? Are the mind and the body same or different? And does one exist after death or not? This is usually phrased as does the Tathagata exist after death? But I think it's quite clear, if we look at the different passages in which those points occur, the Buddha's basically referring here to what we would consider to be the big questions, which are still the big questions today. The Buddha is very prescient in noticing that these sorts of questions, in a sense, are probably unanswerable. And not only are they unanswerable, they're actually a huge distraction. The Buddha refused to say anything about them because he felt that they would distract us from the urgent task at hand. And in fact, the parable, one of the famous parables, is of the man who's been wounded by an arrow, poisoned arrow, but won't let the doctor take the arrow out until he knows the name of the person who shot it. And the Buddha says it's the same way. If you want to pursue my teaching, but you won't do so until I've given you answers to these big questions, then you'll die before you even get round to start. So there's a very strong anti-metaphysical element in the Buddha's teaching. And this, I think, is something I find very attractive. I think it helps us clarify really what matters. The questions of rebirth, different realms of existence, the existence of gods and spirits and so on, to me that is all really academic. It doesn't make much of a difference, really, to how I have to, come to terms with my life as it presents itself moment to moment. And I don't think the Buddha would have had much, he didn't appear to really have any great commitment to those ideas, but in the world the Buddha lived in 5th century BC, Eurasia, rebirth and the basic outlines of karma, in other words, the doctrine of actions and effects over lifetimes, was accepted, as just the way things were, in much the same way that we accept a scientific view of the world today. We don't happily talk about DNA and quarks and hadrons, but if you actually met someone who didn't believe in any of that, you'd be very hard-pressed to explain that was the case. At least I would. And I think it's the same. The idea of rebirth was widespread not only throughout India, North India, but right through into Asia Minor, into Greece, You find passages in the Phaedo of Plato, for example, where Socrates is dying, and some of the last words of Socrates are all very much about rebirth, about looking forward to death because he's lived a good life. Pythagoras likewise accepted this worldview. It was very, very widespread. So I would take those teachings to be a reflex of the world in which he lived, and the Buddha, like all people, has to respond to the kind of worldview that is the case. Some things he rejected quite explicitly, other things did not contradict what he had to say, and he seems to be quite happy to have left them in place. But there are these other passages where it looks quite like that he felt that these sorts of questions were basically a distraction from what really mattered. Yes.
So basically, the entire story is making the Buddha.
Sorry, can you speak up?
The entire.
There we go.
Yeah. Okay.
No, it's not on.
Hello? Okay. The entire lecture you've just given looks to me like it's aimed to describe the Buddha as a human being instead of some godlike event of enlightenment. So how does the enlightenment... You do describe the state of enlightenment of the Buddha. What makes the Buddha enlightened afterwards? What actions of the Buddha after the enlightenment actually describe him as one? So what makes us... We all talk about the moment of enlightenment, but afterwards he still teaches, he's still out of the world, does politics with kings and others. What makes him, which action describe him as enlightened?
All of them. You see, again you said the moment of enlightenment. You see, I think that's already, you've slipped into the problem of thinking that enlightenment is a sort of highly privileged, specific experience, private to the Buddha sitting under a tree. Part of the problem, you see, we have the iconography. We have the picture of the Buddha sitting, his hand touching the earth, serene smile on his face. And that is it is an archetypal image of some sort of enlightenment, if you wish. But it contradicts what the Buddha himself said. I mean, I'll repeat it again. He said, "It's not until my knowledge and vision is entirely clear about the 12 aspects of the Four Noble Truths that I claim to have a peerless awakening in this world." Now, if you unpack that, his awakening is not just about gaining some privileged insight into the nature of reality or something, but it's actually describing a complex way of being in the world that includes the cultivation of the practice of the Eightfold Path, which includes the way you see, think, speak, act, work. It's all there. So awakening is not reducible to some private experience. Awakening is actually a process, not a state. And the Buddha's life, not only in terms of how I've reconstructed it in terms of his dealings with kings and so on, but also in terms of how he related to his community, how he developed and created his community, how he seems to have made considerable efforts for his teaching to survive. All of that was, I think, the embodiment of what we call enlightenment. In other words, I take the Buddha's teaching to be not just what he said, but also what he did. I think his life is an embodiment of his understanding. It's not a sort of an optional extra. In other words, if we have the idea that Buddha, instead of doing all these things and dealing with the problems in his family and hanging out with these kings, if he just sat beneath the Bodhi tree for 45 years and just delivered the Dharma, it wouldn't have been the same. It would have been... I think it's very important to recognise that he didn't sort of set himself up as a sort of isolated spiritual leader living in an ashram or whatever. But he was constantly involved in the affairs of his world. Now, to me, that's significant. People often complain that when you read the Pali text, the Buddha says very little about compassion. It's true. It's there. It's mentioned. But to me, the compassion is in the fact that he's saying and doing what he does. He's embodying these things in all of his actions. Sometimes he gets himself into situations in which he's compromised. This business with the slave girl. You see, he must have known what was going on, even if he wasn't omniscient, as Buddhists believe. These were close members of his family involved in this deception. He was aware that this was going on. Not any fault of his own, but he was somehow caught in a compromised situation. He had students of his own students rebelled against him. Devadatta, his cousin, his brother-in-law, rebelled against him. Tried to set up a much more ascetic model, tried to get him to make vegetarianism a rule, for example. Buddha said, no way. Monks eat what they're given. You find, you really get a sense of a person who is actually in a constant sort of struggle with his world. Now, to me, that says a lot about his integrity and his completeness as a human person. And that, to me, is more inspiring and more real than trying to sort of figure out what was going on in his mind, which, frankly, I don't think we've never really found out. Yes? So, can we have the mic, please? Can you switch it on, please? It'll make a ghastly noise when it's on. Until it does that, it's not working. Oh, there we go.
So, I don't know that much of the literature or something, but is what you're saying heretical to, let's say, monastery people who keep? What you're saying is you'd be very against the way that Buddhism is practiced, and hermits going for 12 years up onto a mountain is actually antithetical to what he believed.
No, I don't think so. No, you see, I think what the Buddha presented was a teaching that responded to the different temperaments and types of people within his community. And so, there were many of his monks who were hermits, basically. Mahamoggalana is a good example. He didn't have a teaching which was like a one-size-fits-all. He recognized that the community, to be vibrant and alive, required a certain sort of plurality. Some of the monks would be very involved in cultivating the jhanas, deep states of meditation, deep insights through that sort of practice. Others would have been more involved in teaching, in pastoral work. Others may well have been involved in all sorts of human activity. And not only were his disciples the monks, they were also lay people. I mean, a good example is Jivaka Komarabucha, who was the doctor to the court of Magadha. This was an important disciple of the Buddha. The Buddha, and this was a man who was working in the royal court. He was a medical doctor, very important figure, and a practitioner of the Dhamma. And again, it's important to recognize that when the Buddha speaks of the Sangha, he talks of the fourfold Sangha: monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen. And anyone who has entered the stream, as he says, which again he defines in a much more open way than is traditionally described today, is part of the Sangha. So the Buddhist Sangha, the Buddhist community, included men and women, both monks and lay people. It gave a framework for practice that wasn't reduced to just becoming skillful in meditation, although that was a very important part of it, but also, it entailed cultivating the way you see the world, the way you think about it, the way you speak, the way you work. All of this was practice. All of these were things to be cultivated, to be brought into being. The word bhavana, which unfortunately is often translated as meditation, means in fact to actually create or to cultivate certain qualities of life. And what is to be cultivated is the Eightfold Path. That's quite clear. So it's not just about being it's not just about being a good meditator. I think nonetheless what you say is true. I think Buddhism over the centuries has tended to privilege as its primary activity a proficiency in meditative skills. And that I think is a great strength of the tradition, but I think that's often been achieved at the cost of not having perhaps really developed other aspects of the path, particularly those that involve work, that involve social relations, and so on. And hence nowadays we have this movement towards engagement, which I think is meant as a sort of to sort of rebalance things a bit. But I do think it's true. I think Buddhism has become identified as a sort of, when you say Buddhist, you almost immediately hear the word meditation following. And I think for us that's valuable, because that's a part in our society, in the West. It's not a tradition, it's not a practice that we really value very highly. We've lost it in the Christian tradition, and the Judaic tradition too, to some extent too, I suspect. So Buddhism, I think, it speaks to us because it's speaking to a certain lack. But I think there's a danger of thinking that that's really what Buddhism is essentially about. I think the Buddhist vision is much broader than that. Any more questions, or shall we wrap, as they say?
I have a silly question.
Okay, silly question's fine. Let's end on a silly question. It's probably not a silly question.
Well, because it's just not clear. Maybe I think I listened well, but it's not clear from your attempt. You started speaking, did the Buddha exist, and the mythical part about him, and so on. And I didn't quite understand. So, it's not important for me if he existed or not. It's just that you researched, and you also spoke about his disciples that appear, and they were in the university as if it's like something. Oh, so Angulimala really existed. So I come out from this talk not clear. What's your opinion? Did he exist? Is it important?
That's not a silly question. It's
maybe I didn't understand.
Well, I never actually addressed that question. I just assumed all along that yes, he existed. I don't think, I'm not aware that any traditional Buddhist or a modern academic scholar would question the existence of the Buddha. The earliest hard evidence we have of the Buddha's existence are found in the inscriptions of King Ashoka. And these would have been inscribed in rock and mention the Buddha by name about 150 years after his death, which was quite close. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that everybody who's mentioned in the canon has a similar claim to existence, but to me it seems that as a working assumption, one should take the fact that these people were actually human beings living on Earth at that time. I see no real reason to doubt that. Of course, we cannot know for sure. There's no way of actually nailing it down. The same would be true of the Moses, let's say, or Jesus. I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, scholars are always trying to sort of find some proof. You know, on some cave somewhere, there's Gautama was here or something. We're not going to find anything like that. We're not going to find any. Well, we have found. There probably are some relics of the Buddha that I think are almost certainly going back to his period. Two particular stupas in Vaishali and a couple of Vastu are at the right archaeological depth. They appear as they're described in the text. So we probably do have some ash or some physical remains, but again, we can never prove that there wasn't some hoax or something, or that they actually belonged to that person. We'll never know that. Now, so I think we do need to keep a certain healthy skepticism about these claims. But one of the things that really persuades me in a way is that the story that unravels when you begin to put it all together is so weirdly and quirkily human. It's very difficult to see why anyone would have made it up later. And the fact is, it's been largely forgotten. The other key to this story, in my own research in this story, is a book called a dictionary of Pali proper names. Now, I'd known about this book for some time and had said to myself, why would I need a dictionary of Pali proper names? So I never bought it. I never even saw it. Nobody had it. But when I did finally get a copy of this thing, you realize it's almost criminally mistitled. It's 1,300 pages. It's an encyclopedia, and it cites every person and every place mentioned in the Pali Canon with detailed descriptions of where these persons and places appear in the canonical texts. There's potted biographies of all the figures, descriptions of all the places, all cross-referenced. You can get it now for free on the internet. And this was done in 1935 by a Sri Lankan scholar called G.P. Malala-Sekul. Incredible piece of work. Very few people are aware of it. But what it does essentially is that it presents this highly complex set of characters, all of whom, even the minor ones, are represented consistently throughout thousands of pages of text. They might only occur 3 or 4 times. It's the alternative theory that this story and these characters are all somehow invented later and then put in is far more problematic. In fact, it's almost unbelievable. For one thing, it's the people who remembered the canon, the discourses, the Dhamma, the teachings, had no interest in remembering all this stuff. It's just like background information. It's just context. But when and this is what I've been doing for the last few years, is instead of reading the suttas in order to find the Dharma, this is a joke I've told many times, I started reading the suttas in order to find the drama. In other words, instead of reading over all of these names and places that I haven't got a clue about and looking for the teaching, I started to do the other way around. And what's really amazing is when you pull out these little fragments, because none of this story is presented in one go. It's all scattered through hundreds of texts. You have to very systematically pull out these little bits, like a jigsaw puzzle. But when you put it all together, it all hangs together. The characters are consistent, the story is consistent. The human world comes alive before your eyes. It's really quite amazing. I had one particular epiphany, and that is on reading Majjhima 89, the 89th discourse of the middle-length teachings, called the Dhammacettiya Sutta, which describes the last meeting between the Buddha and Kimpa Senadi. And when I read that, which is a weird text, because there's no Dharma in it at all. There's no teaching, nothing. All the Buddha says is like, well said, or why are you honouring me, great king? The rest is just a story. It's very moving. But when I read that, suddenly the whole thing clicked into place. And that's what I've been working on since, basically. But yes, so it is, epiphanies are not historical data, right? It's intuitive. It's my own kind of passion that is reading this stuff. But I found this very valuable on many levels. I think we're going to stop here. Thank you very much for